The sound of a body hitting the earth is distinct. A heavy, wet thud that you feel in your chest before you fully hear it. 1 second, the backyard was filled with the harmless noise of a suburban barbecue. The sizzle of burgers, the clinking of beer bottles, the hum of polite conversation. The next, all of that was replaced by that sickening thud and a silence. So sudden it felt like the air had been sucked out of the neighborhood. I was already on the ground, my body draped over his back with the lazy familiarity of someone settling into a favorite armchair. My arm was locked under his chin, cinched tight in a textbook rear-naked choke that I applied with zero effort. Beneath me, Kyle, my 20-year-old cousin, the brand-new Marine infantryman, was thrashing like a fish on a deck. His face had gone from a flushed red to a deep, alarming purple, and his hand was frantically tapping my forearm. Tap, tap, tap. I wasn't straining, honestly. I was barely paying attention to him. I was looking up at the rest of them. My aunt had dropped a serving spoon into the potato salad, staring at us with her mouth hanging open. My uncle, usually the loudest voice in any room, stood with his beer halfway to his mouth, frozen in absolute disbelief. They didn't even see how I got there. To my family, I was just Maya, the cousin who taught yoga classes and vaguely traveled for work to places they couldn't be bothered to find on a map. They didn't know that while Kyle was learning how to make his bed properly. At Paris Island, I was dismantling terror cells in the Maghreb. To understand why I had to put him to sleep at a family cookout, you have to understand the difference between a soldier and a ghost. 3 hours earlier, the atmosphere was completely different. It was Kyle's welcome home party, and the air was thick with humidity and hero worship. He was fresh out of boot camp, buzzing with the loud, unearned confidence of a man who has learned how to shoot a rifle but has never actually had to use one. My parents were beaming at him, looking at him with the kind of radiant pride they usually reserved for winning lottery tickets or children who didn't disappoint them. I sat on the periphery, nursing a lukewarm soda next to Mark, my teammate from the unit. I had introduced him as my date to avoid the usual interrogation about why I was still single, but really, he was just there as a buffer. We watched my parents fawn over Kyle's haircut and his posture, listening as they compared his service to my wandering. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was tallying the score. They saw a warrior in a crisp uniform. I saw a kid who didn't know yet that uniforms don't stop bullets. Eventually, the attention wasn't enough for him. Kyle stood up to hold court, clearing a space on the lawn to show off his MC map, the Marine Corps martial arts program moves he'd just learned. He demonstrated a few choppy throws on the air, basking in the applause of awestruck relatives who wouldn't know a hip toss from a hug. Then, his eyes landed on me. He needed a prop, and the slender yoga teacher looked like the easiest target in the room. He smirked, his voice carrying that grating, condescending tone that only family can perfect. "You look fit, Maya, for a civilian," he announced, gesturing to my arms. "But that gym muscle is useless in the real world. All that stretching, you wouldn't last 5 seconds in my world." He reached out and grabbed my wrist. It was meant to be playful, a demonstration for the crowd, but his grip was tight, a clumsy, arrogant attempt at a wrist lock that left him wide open. "See?" He laughed, twisting my arm just enough to hurt. "You're already dead." My hand didn't move. My pulse didn't spike. But deep in the lizard brain that I had spent a decade refining, a switch flickered. My fingers twitched once, a reflex to shatter his radius and collapse his windpipe, but I forced them still. He laughed, thinking he was the apex predator in the backyard. He had no idea he was grabbing the wrist of a woman who had killed men twice his size in silence. My parents had a specific tone they reserved for me, a particular frequency of apology and vague embarrassment that they used whenever company came over. My mother, Susan, a woman who treated her family's reputation like a fragile antique that I was constantly in danger of dropping, would always lower her voice when the neighbors asked what I was doing with my life. "Oh, Maya?" she'd say, waving a manicured hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "She's still with that logistics NGO. You know how it is. Moving cargo, humanitarian aid, paper pushing. It pays the bills, but it's not honorable. Not like what Kyle is doing." They looked at me and saw a drifter, a woman pushing 30 with no husband, no permanent address, and a job they couldn't explain in a single proud sentence. To them, I was the invisible child, because I chose to be invisible. If they really saw me, if they saw the things I've done to keep their world spinning, they wouldn't be disappointed. They'd be terrified. Then there was Kyle, my cousin, the family's newly minted golden boy, who had worn a uniform for exactly 3 months, was being treated like he had single-handedly stormed the beaches of Normandy. He stood by the cooler, gripping a beer like a grenade, recounting tales of basic training with the gravity of a war memoir. He talked about the crucible and drill sergeants with a breathless intensity that had my uncles nodding solemnly, their eyes wide with unearned respect. They looked at him and saw a warrior. They looked at me and saw a waste of potential. I sipped my lukewarm soda, listening to him describe the stress of a 5 a.m. wake to up call. And I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper just to keep from laughing. The irony was suffocating because 3 weeks ago, while Kyle was learning how to fold his socks in a barracks, I was in a safe house on the Syrian border. I wasn't moving cargo, I was the security detail for a high-value asset that didn't technically exist. I wasn't wearing yoga pants and a messy bun, I was carrying 60 pounds of kit, my face painted in camo, the world reduced to the grainy green phosphor of night vision goggles. The silence in that hallway wasn't the awkward silence of a family party. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a killbox. Silence on comms, I had whispered, my voice barely a vibration in the throat mic. Check your corners. Fatal funnel ahead. The breach was supposed to be clean, but in my line of work, supposed to is the phrase that gets you killed. The door on the left opened before we cleared the threshold. A hostile stepped out, weapon raising. The men behind me, elite in their own right, were a fraction of a second too slow. I wasn't. I didn't make a conscious decision to move, my body just executed the program it had been running for a decade. I closed the distance before his rifle leveled, slipping inside his guard. It was efficient, brutal, and precise, CQB in its purest form. I spun him, locking my arm under his chin in the exact same motion Kyle had just mocked in the backyard. But in that hallway there was no tapping. I applied the pressure, not to hold, but to end. I felt the fight drain out of him, the frantic struggle turning into a heavy, dead weight against my chest. I lowered him to the floor silently, checked my sectors, and kept moving. That was the reality. I wasn't a logistics clerk moving boxes, I was a kinetic specialist moving obstacles. And sometimes, the obstacles were human. Back at the barbecue, the contrast was so sharp it made me dizzy. Kyle was now lecturing his father, my Uncle Bob, about situational awareness. "You gotta keep your head on a swivel, Dad," Kyle said, puffing his chest out. "You never know where the threat is coming from." He took a long swig of beer, his back completely turned to the open gate, totally oblivious to the delivery driver walking up the driveway. He was playing soldier, reciting lines from a manual he barely understood. I, on the other hand, couldn't turn it off. I was leaning against the fence, but my eyes were constantly moving. I had already clocked the exit routes, the side gate had a rusty latch, the sliding glass door was unlocked, and the hedges on the east side were thick enough for concealment. I noted that my aunt was holding a knife to cut the cake, a potential weapon, and that the dog was agitated. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. I was calculating cover and concealment between bites of potato salad. Mark, my teammate, nudged my elbow, breaking my trance. He was the only one here who knew the truth, the only one who knew that the logistics coordinator, standing next to him, had a higher kill count than the entire local police force combined. He caught me staring at Kyle's exposed jugular while he laughed. Mark leaned in close, his voice a low rumble meant only for me. "Stand down, yoga teacher," he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. "We're not in Yemen. The burgers aren't hostile." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and forced a smile onto my face. It felt like a mask, stiff and unnatural. I looked at my parents, who were listening to Kyle with rapt attention, and I felt that familiar sting, the internal ledger updating itself. They would never look at me like that. They would never know that the safety they enjoyed, the peace that allowed them to drink beer in the sun, was paid for by the things I did in the dark. It took every ounce of my discipline to smile and nod while he lectured me on toughness. But discipline is what keeps you alive. Ego is what gets you killed. Kyle was about to learn that lesson the hard way. As the afternoon wore on, the cooler emptied and Kyle's bravado swelled, fed by cheap beer and the adoration of a family that didn't know better. He was itching for a physical demonstration, a live target to prove that his 3 months of training made him superior to everyone else in the zip code. His eyes scanned the yard and landed on me again, narrowing with a predator's clumsiness. "Come on, cuz," he slurred slightly, stepping into my personal space with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I promise I won't hurt you. Just want to show everyone the difference between gym strength and combat strength." It was a challenge issued in front of the whole tribe, a way to elevate himself by lowering me, and I felt the collective gaze of my parents settle on us, waiting to see if I would embarrass them. I didn't take the bait. In my world, you don't fight unless there is no other option, and you certainly don't fight for applause. "Kyle, sit down," I said, keeping my voice level and boring, the voice of the tired cousin who just wanted to eat her burger in peace. "Enjoy the party. Nobody wants to see us wrestle in the grass." I thought that would be enough, a polite out that let him keep his dignity. But to a man like Kyle, refusal looks like fear. He sneered, looking back at our uncles for approval, feeding off their expectant grins. "Don't be a snowflake, Maya, just one round. Unless you're scared you'll break a nail?" Mark stepped forward then, moving between us with the fluid grace of a man who knows exactly where everyone in the room is standing. "Kyle," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its friendly party veneer. "You don't want to do this. Trust me." It was a lifeline, a professional warning disguised as casual advice. But Kyle just laughed, waving a dismissive hand at Mark, like he was shooing away a fly. "Back off, civilian boyfriend," he scoffed, puffing his chest out. "Let the adults handle this." He didn't see the look Mark shot me, a subtle shake of the head that said, "I tried." Then, Kyle made the mistake that changed everything. He reached out and shoved my shoulder, a hard, disrespectful check that rattled my teeth and forced me to take a step back. "Come on," he shouted, stepping back into a jagged, amateur boxing stance, fists raised high near his face. "Fight back." That shove was the permission slip. He had crossed the line from annoying relative to physical aggressor. The yoga teacher mask didn't just slip, it shattered. I set my drink down on the railing, deliberate and slow, staring right through him. I didn't raise my fists. I didn't bounce on my toes or tuck my chin. I stood completely still, my hands open and relaxed at my sides, my weight evenly distributed. It wasn't the stance of someone preparing to box. It was the stance of someone preparing to end a threat. The chatter in the yard died down as the family noticed the shift in my eyes, the sudden terrifying absence of emotion. I wasn't Maya anymore. I gave him 3 chances to walk away. In my line of work, you rarely get one. He mistook my patience for fear. Big mistake. The circle formed around us with the speed of a schoolyard fight, aunts and uncles tightening the perimeter, their phones raised like digital torches. They were grinning, expecting a playful tussle where the big, strong Marine would gently toss his delicate yoga instructor cousin into the grass, a little physical comedy to accompany the potato salad. I saw my mother clutching her wine glass, a look of preemptive pity on her face, already preparing the comforting words she'd offer me after I was humbled. It was the same look she gave me when I missed prom, or when I didn't get into the right college. A look that said my failure was inevitable. But inside the circle, the air had changed. I wasn't at a barbecue anymore. I was in a kinetic environment, and the man in front of me wasn't family. He was a hostile variable. Kyle was bouncing on his toes, burning unnecessary energy, his hands held high in a guard that left his ribs wide open. He looked like a boxer from a bad movie, confusing movement with capability. I stood flat-footed, conserving oxygen, watching his shoulders. He telegraphed the strike from a mile away. A dip of the right shoulder, a tightening of the jaw, sending me a written invitation before he even threw the punch. When he finally lunged, it was a wide, looping right hook meant to grab my collar, a move born of arrogance rather than technique. He expected me to flinch or retreat, to scramble backward like a scared civilian. I didn't retreat. I stepped in. I closed the distance instantly, invading the space he thought belonged to him. It's the last thing an amateur expects. For the target to become the projectile. My left hand parried his forearm, brushing it aside with zero effort, redirecting his momentum so he was effectively throwing himself past me. In the same motion, I stepped my hip across his center line, disrupting his gravity, and swept his lead leg. It wasn't a struggle, it was physics. There was a blur of motion, a momentary suspension of weight, and then the sickening thud of a 200-pound body hitting the earth without the ability to break its fall. The breath left his lungs in a violent whoosh, a sound that cut through the ambient chatter like a gunshot. I didn't give him a second to process the impact. Before he could even try to scramble, I was on him, transitioning to his back with the fluid automatic muscle memory of 1,000 drills. My legs hooked around his waist to secure the position, and my right arm slid under his chin. I didn't squeeze his windpipe. That's painful and messy. I went for the carotids, sinking in a blood choke that shuts the lights out in seconds. I locked my hands, cinching the hold tight, pressing my chest against his back to flatten him out. He began to thrash, his hands clawing uselessly at my forearm, panic overriding his training. I brought my mouth close to his ear, isolating him from the crowd, creating a private moment of education in the middle of the spectacle. "Control your breathing, Marine," I whispered, my voice flat and terrifyingly calm against the chaos of his struggle. "You're flailing like a chaotic amateur, tap or nap." His face had turned a deep, mottled purple, his eyes bulging as the oxygen to his brain was throttled. He realized then that this wasn't a game. I held his consciousness in the crook of my elbow. He slapped my arm frantically. Tap, tap, tap. I released the pressure instantly, uncoiling and standing up in one smooth motion. I wasn't out of breath. My hair wasn't even messy. I stood over him, watching him cough and heave, looking down with the detached clinical interest of a surgeon closing a patient. The silence in the backyard was heavier than the humidity. For the first time in his life, Kyle looked at me and didn't see a cousin. He saw a superior officer. The adrenaline dump that follows a confrontation is usually the dangerous part. The shake in the hands, the tunnel vision. But I felt nothing but a cool, detached calm. Kyle lay in the grass, his chest heaving like a bellows, his hands clutching his throat, as he tried to pull air back into lungs that had been momentarily denied it. The family circle had widened, stepping back as if I were a downed power line sparking on the wet pavement. I looked at my parents. The pity was gone from my mother's face, replaced by a hollow, stunned confusion. My father looked at me as if a stranger had just walked out of his daughter's skin. I extended a hand down to Kyle. He flinched at first, a natural reaction to the person who just choked you unconscious, but then he saw my face. The operator was fading back behind the cousin. I wasn't a threat anymore, I was just Maya again. He took my hand, his grip shaky and sweat-slicked, and I hauled him to his feet with a single sturdy pull. He rubbed his neck, looking at me with eyes that were wide and wet. "Where the hell?" He wheezed, his voice raspy and broken. "Where the hell did you learn that?" I smiled, sliding the mask of the harmless civilian back into place, though we both knew it didn't fit quite right anymore. "Yoga retreat," I said, my voice light and airy. "Ashrams can be pretty rough if you break the silence." Beside the cooler, Mark let out a short, barking laugh that he quickly disguised as a cough, shaking his head at the audacity of the lie. The silence lingered, thick and awkward, until the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel broke the spell. It was my grandfather, Grandpa Joe, a Vietnam vet who spent most family gatherings sitting in a lawn chair, staring at the tree line and drinking cheap beer in silence. He walked into the center of the circle, his movements stiff with age but deliberate. He didn't look at the potato salad or the shocked relatives. He looked at Kyle, then he turned his faded gray eyes to me. He didn't ask about yoga. He didn't ask about logistics or cargo movements. He looked at my hands, resting relaxed at my sides, and then he looked into my eyes with a recognition that sent a chill down my spine. He saw it. He saw the training, the discipline, and the violence that I kept folded up inside like a parachute. He nodded, a slow, singular movement of respect. Nice technique, kid, he rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. Clean. No wasted movement. You controlled the drop. He turned to Kyle, who was still massaging his bruised ego. You got beat by a professional, son, Joe said, loud enough for my parents to hear. Nothing to be ashamed of. Just stop picking fights you can't win, and for God's sake keep your chin tucked. That single sentence from the old man did more than the chokehold ever